When people complain that everything seems to get more expensive year after year, they often believe this is a sign that the system is broken. But history tells a different story. From the earliest days of modern capitalism, inflation was not a sign of weakness but a deliberate design. It is a hidden engine, propelling societies forward and preventing collapse. By the end of this video, you will fully understand why everything gets more expensive and why it must. Inflation is not evidence of failure, but of design. It is a hidden motor of capitalism, the reason debts can be repaid, investments can flourish, and societies can progress. Without it, the system would freeze, debt would suffocate economies, and growth would collapse. The first institutionalized experiments with monetary policy began in the 17th century. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was created not only to finance the wars of William III, but also to stabilize the British economy in a way that private gold reserves never could. By issuing government-backed banknotes, the bank could expand credit and, in turn, stimulate commerce. This was an early recognition of a principle that would later become orthodox economic thinking. A growing economy needs a growing money supply, and with it, a modest level of inflation. Fast forward to 1913, when the Federal Reserve was established in the United States through the Federal Reserve Act. America had suffered repeated financial panics, the most recent being the devastating crash of 1907. Lawmakers understood that without a central authority to regulate credit and manage the money supply, the economy would lurch from boom to bust. The Federal Reserve's mandate was clear. It would aim for price stability, full employment, and moderate long-term interest rates. That meant accepting some level of inflation as not only inevitable but desirable. It was John Maynard Keynes who gave intellectual weight to this principle. In his groundbreaking General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936, Keynes argued that without inflation, economies risk stagnation. Deflation, the falling of prices over time, can be catastrophic, as it discourages investment and makes debts harder to repay. The Great Depression of the 1930s was a case study in how deflation can paralyze an economy, bankrupt companies, and create mass unemployment. Policymakers vowed never to let that happen again. By the second half of the 20th century, the idea of a healthy inflation rate had become orthodoxy. Today, institutions like the European Central Bank, founded in 1998, and the Federal Reserve both target around 2% annual inflation. That number is not arbitrary. It is a sweet spot where money loses value slowly enough to avoid panic, but quickly enough to keep capital moving, debts payable, and economies growing. Inflation, in other words, is not a flaw. It is a feature embedded deep in the DNA of modern capitalism. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Why must money lose value? Why is inflation not only tolerated but required in a capitalist system? The answer lies in how capitalism organizes investment, debt, and growth. Capitalism is not simply about producing goods. It is about the continuous circulation of capital. Money must flow, changing hands rapidly to keep factories running, workers employed, and innovations funded. Economists call this the velocity of money, the speed at which currency circulates within the economy. If money were perfectly stable in value, or worse, if it became more valuable over time, people would hoard it. Why spend or invest today when your money will buy more tomorrow? Such behavior would slow down the velocity of money, choke investment, and eventually stall the economy. This is why capitalism needs inflation. It creates a subtle but powerful incentive to use money rather than store it. Money, under inflation, is like ice left out in the sun. It melts slowly but surely. To preserve its value, you must put it to work, either by investing it in businesses, placing it in a bank account to earn interest, or purchasing assets like real estate. Inflation is a mechanism that ensures capital does not freeze but circulates. Let us consider the role of debt. In modern economies, debt is not an aberration, but the very lifeblood of growth. Governments issue bonds to finance infrastructure and social programs. Companies borrow to expand factories or invest in research. Individuals take out loans to buy homes, cars, or education. All of these debts are easier to repay when money loses value over time. A loan of $100,000 today is daunting, but if after 10 years of inflation, wages and prices have doubled, that same debt is effectively halved in real terms. Inflation erodes debt burdens, making the system sustainable. This was recognized by Milton Friedman, one of the towering figures of 20th century economics. In 1976, he received the Nobel Prize for his work on monetary theory. Friedman famously said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. By this, he meant that inflation is directly tied to the expansion of money supply. But even Friedman admitted that moderate inflation could serve as a lubricant for economic activity. Without it, the gears of capitalism grind to a halt. To see this in action, consider the dramatic tenure of Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987. In the late 1970s, the United States suffered from runaway inflation, with rates exceeding 13%. Volcker responded by raising interest rates to nearly 20%, intentionally causing recession in order to break inflationary expectations. His policy was brutal, driving unemployment above 10%, but restored faith in the dollar. Importantly, however, Volcker never aimed for zero inflation. His goal was stable, predictable inflation in the low single digits. Why? Because even the staunchest inflation fighter knew that without some inflation, capitalism cannot function. Let us ground this in an everyday example. Picture a supermarket in the year 2000. A loaf of bread cost about $1 in the United States. Today, that same loaf costs roughly $2. If you had kept the dollar bill under your mattress for 25 years, it would no longer buy that loaf. The purchasing power would have melted away. But if you had deposited that dollar in a bank account or invested in the stock market, you would likely have more than $2 today. Inflation punishes hoarding but rewards investment. It is a silent force pushing you to participate in the system. Think, too, of wages. If inflation averages 2% per year and your employer raises your salary by 3%, you are 1% richer in real terms. But most people see only the rising prices and not the increase in their income. This is why inflation is so often misunderstood. It feels like theft, but in reality, it is the very thing that allows debts to be manageable, investments to be profitable, and economies to grow. Historically, when societies abandoned inflation, the results were catastrophic. In the 1930s, deflation in the United States and Europe made debts unpayable, bankrupted businesses, and prolonged the Great Depression. In contrast, after World War II, inflation helped reduce the enormous debts incurred during the conflict. By the 1950s and 1960s, Western economies were booming and moderate inflation was part of the recipe. The takeaway is stark. Capitalism is structurally dependent on money losing value. Without inflation, growth would stall, debts would suffocate economies, and people would retreat into hoarding rather than investing. Inflation is not an accident. It is the engine of the system. If inflation is so essential, how is it created and managed? This is the task of central banks, which wield powerful tools to engineer the pace at which money loses value. Their primary instrument is the control of interest rates. By raising or lowering the cost of borrowing, they influence how much money circulates in the economy. Low interest rates encourage borrowing and spending, stimulating inflation. High rates do the opposite, cooling the economy and reducing inflationary pressure. But in the 21st century, central banks have gone further. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan engaged in quantitative easing, the large-scale purchase of government bonds and other assets. This flooded economies with liquidity, pushing up asset prices and preventing deflation. Between 2008 and 2015, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded by more than $4 trillion. This was not a side effect, but a deliberate attempt to engineer inflation. Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank since 2019, has been explicit about this policy. The ECB's target is inflation close to but below 2%. This figure may sound technical, but it represents a careful balancing act. Too much inflation, as in Zimbabwe in the 2000s or Venezuela in the 2010s, destroys trust in money. In Germany during the hyperinflation of 1923, people sometimes carried banknotes in wheelbarrows just to buy basic goods, such as a loaf of bread, which was at 200 billion mark in November 1923. I myself found a 100 mark stamp in one of my great-grandfather's old books. Later, even stamps worth billions were issued or simply overprinted on existing stamps of lower value. Too little inflation, on the other hand, as in Japan's lost decade since the 1990s, leads to stagnation because falling or flat prices discourage both consumers and investors. People delayed purchases in the expectation that goods will be cheaper tomorrow. The Japanese companies postponed investments due to weak demand, and debts became heavier in real terms. The result was instilled as a vicious cycle of low spending, low growth, and declining confidence in the economy. The art of central banking is to maintain inflation in the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. Even though inflation is economically rational, it remains politically toxic. The reason lies in psychology. People are subject to what behavioral economists call the money illusion. They focus on nominal prices rather than real purchasing power. If wages rise by 3% but prices by 2%, you are richer. But most people notice only that their groceries or rent have gone up. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002, demonstrated that people strongly resist nominal wage cuts, even if real wages are stable or rising. Politicians therefore find it easier to allow inflation to erode purchasing power silently rather than to announce wage reductions openly. Inflation is thus both a technical instrument and political tool, one that governments use carefully to avoid public backlash. Looking ahead, inflation will remain central to capitalism's future. New technologies like cryptocurrencies challenge the system by offering deflationary alternatives. Bitcoin, capped at 21 million coins, is inherently anti-inflationary, but this very feature makes it unsuitable as a global currency. A deflationary money supply encourages hoarding, not investment, and undermines the velocity of money. Meanwhile, structural pressures will make inflation management harder. Climate change is expected to push food and energy prices upward. Geopolitical conflicts disrupt supply chains, while demographic shifts alter labor markets. A 2023 study by the International Monetary Fund predicts that the energy transition alone will cause persistent inflationary pressures for decades. Central banks will be forced to navigate these challenges while maintaining public trust. Inflation, then, is not going away. It is part of capitalism's architecture, a design that ensures growth, reduces the burden of debt, and prevents stagnation. Everything becoming more expensive is not the sign of a broken system. It is a sign of one working exactly as intended.